Gentlemen, what is an absolute red flag a woman can raise on the first date? I went to meet a woman from an online dating site, and at the last minute, she texted me asking if I could come by her house, which was just a few blocks away from the Starbucks where we were supposed to meet. In hindsight, this should have been a red flag, but we had chatted a lot online, so I felt comfortable enough. I figured maybe she just needed a ride or something. When I arrived at her house, she opened the door. I was surprised to see that she was wearing an ankle bracelet. She immediately began explaining that she didn't mention it in the dating site because she didn't want to scare me off and asked if I could hear her out. I felt uneasy but was also curious, so I agreed to sit down in her living room for a few minutes. She told me that she had been involved in a dispute with her ex, which had turned hostile, and as a result, she was serving a 30-day home detention. Just then, a teenage girl who was quite overweight came into the room. The woman then mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she also came with this teenage girl. At this point, I was eager to leave, so I started making excuses. But she kept insisting that I stay. She said, "Please, just one date after I'm off house arrest. There's so much I could learn from someone as smart as you." I simply said, "I really have to go. I'll think about it," and made my way to the door. She followed me outside, explaining that her bracelet had a range of several feet outside the house. While I was searching for my car keys next to my car, she unexpectedly grabbed my hand and placed her. She looked at me with a mischievous grin. I quickly got into my car without saying anything and drove away. It was such a relief to leave that situation behind. So asking me about red flags might not be a great idea, but I like to think I've learned a lot since then. A situation is where you say, "Oh, no way," and get up and leave. I mean, she can't chase after you anyway. Story 2. Back in high school, I attended a basketball game where I struck up a conversation with some students from the opposing school. I ended up talking with this girl. Let's call her Laura. We got along surprisingly well right from the start, which was unexpected because she was quite attractive, and I considered myself average at best. After our conversation, one of my friends pulled me aside and advised me that pursuing anything with Laura might not be the best idea. He mentioned that he knew her and that she already had a boyfriend. I hadn't noticed any signs of that, and since this particular friend wasn't always the most reliable source of information, I decided to continue talking with her. A few days after the game, Laura and I were still in touch, and I decided to ask her out on a date. She agreed, and at that point I thought my friend must have been mistaken. However, after doing a bit of research online, I discovered that Laura not only had one boyfriend, but 2. On top of that, I found out some other things about her personality that didn't sit well with me. Definitely not qualities I was looking for in a relationship. Even though I realized this was a deal breaker, I was too socially awkward to cancel the date. So I came up with the idea to invite our mutual friend to join us as a third wheel, hoping he could unintentionally make the date less successful. I jokingly referred to him as the anti-wingman. He played the part perfectly, making the whole situation pretty uncomfortable, even offering her his jacket when it got chilly. Months later, while joking about the experience with him, I mentioned the anti-wingman role, expecting him to laugh. Instead, he looked at me puzzled and asked, "What do you mean by anti-wingman?" It turns out he had no clue he was supposed to be making things awkward. He was just naturally that bad at it. It's hilarious that his friend was unknowingly perfect for the role of anti-wingman. Story 3. Your well-intentioned coworker enthusiastically sets you up on a blind date with a friend of hers who she describes as a lot of fun. Wanted to be open-minded, you agree to meet this friend at a local bar. However, before the date, her friend asks if you can pick her up because she no longer has her driver's license. When you arrive at her apartment, you notice she's in a heated argument with a man standing outside. She ends the exchange with an unfriendly gesture before getting into your car. It's at this moment you realize she's brought along a suitcase full of her belongings. You both head to the bar and order drinks with your meal. You sip your drink slowly, but she quickly finishes her 5th. Throughout the meal, you find it difficult to contribute to the conversation. Not because you're uninterested, but because she continuously interrupts to share stories from her challenging childhood. When the bill arrives, she slides it over to you and casually mentions that she doesn't have any money, assuming you were planning to cover the entire date. On the way back to the car, she expresses a desire to take things further, but reassures you that there's no chance of pregnancy since she's already expecting a child with another man. She then asks if she can stay with you for a few weeks, explaining that she's in a tough spot until she starts a new job on Monday. The man she was arguing with earlier had been letting her stay with him, but things got complicated when she started bringing other men to his apartment. As you drive her back to her place, she becomes increasingly forward, making you uncomfortable. Despite your polite attempts to decline her advances, she insists on following you home. Unfortunately, you realize you live in the same apartment complex, just a short walk from where you picked her up. When you reach your door, she becomes overly insistent in coming inside. In a moment of panic, your phone rings. It's a telemarketer, but you pretend it's an important work call. Using this as an excuse, you step outside, lock the car, and hope she loses interest. She follows you to your car, asking when you'll return. You manage to drive away, leaving her behind, and find yourself sitting in a mall parking lot for a few hours, trying to calm down. As you light a nicotine stick, something you haven't done in over a year, you realize that maybe your coworker didn't have your best interests in mind when setting up this date. That was like a first-person POV of a tour of a red flag factory. Story 4. About 20 years ago, my mom thought it would be a good idea for me to meet this woman whose mother she knew. Both moms seemed to think it would be nice if their only children became friends, so they arranged for us to meet. I'd never met her before, and she didn't know anything about me either, so I figured, why not give it a try? We met at a restaurant, and as soon as we were seated, even before the waiter had a chance to hand us the menu, she came right out and said, "I'm looking for a man to have children with because I want kids now." The waiter gave me a sympathetic smile as he handed me the menu, sensing the awkwardness of the situation. What followed was a long monologue where she listed all the men she had dated before, explaining how each one had failed to meet her standards. Some came from families she didn't approve of. Others weren't able to have children, and some had other qualities she didn't like. She then mentioned that she had high hopes for me because her mom and my mom had told her I was a nice, decent man. To be honest, she was way out of my league. She was stunning, with long black hair and striking blue eyes, and she was in great shape. On top of that, she was very intelligent. I was on her way to becoming a pharmacist. Meanwhile, I considered myself fairly average, hadn't gone to college and was working in a public service. Despite her differences, she made it clear right away that she wanted to get married and have kids as soon as possible. So there I was in my mid-20s, sitting across from this beautiful and intelligent woman who spent 2 hours talking about herself and her plans to marry and start a family right away. At the end of the date, she offered to drive me home, but made it clear that there wouldn't be any physical relationship unless I was willing to marry her. On the drive home, we talked a bit about her studies, but the conversation took a turn when a woman I knew happened to see me in the car and smiled at me while waiting at a crossing. This made her upset, and she started questioning me about how I knew that woman and whether I knew many other women. When we finally arrived at my place, I quickly thanked her for the ride and hurried inside. She tried to reach out to me over the next 2 weeks, but I managed to avoid her. I later heard that she got married, had twins, and eventually divorced her husband. Story 5. A few weeks into dating my first real girlfriend, things started to feel a bit off. She began telling me stories about how she was hanging out at an old friend's place, and one of his friends was making advances toward her. I suggested she simply walk away, but she kept coming up with reasons why she couldn't leave. She mentioned that they were all in a room together, making it difficult for her to get out of the situation. I told her to let this guy know that she had a boyfriend who wasn't okay with his behavior. She responded by saying that he started making threats toward me. She kept asking what I wanted her to say to him, but I didn't take it too seriously since this was all being relayed to me through her, and I had never met the guy. This kind of situation started happening more often. She would tell me that another guy was being overly hostile towards her, trying to provoke a reaction from me. I was only a minor at that moment, so I tried to act tough. But in reality, I was just confused by the whole thing. After about a month of dating, she told me that her best friend's boyfriend had texted her, saying he was in love with her and suggesting they run away together. We all went to the same high school, so the idea of them running away seemed a bit far-fetched. She kept updating me on this, and I started to question the whole situation. Why would such a nice guy want to leave his girlfriend? Why was this conversation even continuing? Had she made it clear she wasn't interested? Should it be easy for her to put an end to this? She got frustrated that I wasn't reacting the way she wanted, so she escalated the situation by telling me that she was kind of considering it. That was the breaking point for me. I responded with, "Really? Well, then we should break up." Her attitude changed quickly. She said she didn't mean it, that she was sorry, and that she didn't even like the guy. Looking back, I'm proud of my old self for standing up for myself and ending the relationship right then and there. It became clear later on that it's pretty obvious that she enjoyed making guys jealous and was likely making up these stories to get a reaction out of me. Since then, in every relationship I've had, I kept an eye out for the red flag of every guy I talk to is into me. Story 6. Though I'm late to the conversation, here's my story. I'd been messaging a girl on a dating app, but after a couple of exchanges, she stopped responding. I figured that was the end of it. Then about 2 weeks later, she suddenly replied, apologizing for the silence and explained that she had been in a car accident. She even sent me a picture of the damaged car. This raised some doubts for me, but I decided to keep the conversation going. We chatted for a bit and she suggested that we meet up to do some grass. She seemed cute, so I thought, why not? I arrived at her place and she got into the car, muttering something about her roommate having an awkward conversation with her while she was in the shower. It was a bit strange, but I brushed it off. As we drove to a spot to smoke, she started talking about the car accident again, mentioning that it was caused by an intoxicated driver. Then out of nowhere, she said, "My dad is in the Hells Angels, so I'll just get him and his buddies to pay the guy a visit." All I could say was, "Excuse me?" She repeated herself, this time hinting at the possibility of some harm and adding that she might get her dad's Hells Angels lawyer to sue the guy. By this point, we had started lighting up cigarettes, and I wasn't sure if I was hearing her correctly, so I asked, "A Hells Angels lawyer?" She snapped back at me. "That's what I just said." At this point, I was feeling pretty uneasy. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see her dad riding up in a motorcycle, swinging something, but nothing happened. She continued talking about her 4 jobs, all somehow connected to the Hells Angels. After about 40 minutes of listening to her wild stories, I politely told her I had to be up early and offered to take her home. I dropped her off, smiled, waved, and said, "It was nice meeting you." As soon as I drove away, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. In fact, I was so happy to be free of the situation that I started laughing uncontrollably, full-on joyful laughter. I'll never forget how relieved I felt, knowing I was heading home to my quiet place and my cat, rather than getting involved with someone who seemed to bring a lot of chaos with her. It made me really appreciate being single for a while. Story 7. Getting too attached right before or during the first date has been something I've encountered quite a bit. I met a lot of girls online, and we would usually chat for a bit before deciding to meet in person. In my view, the first few dates are more about getting to know each other and figuring out if there's any mutual interest. It's a casual process, and if things click, you take it from there. However, I've had quite a few experiences where girls would start treating things very seriously right from the start. They would talk about long-term plans, call me perfect, and have expectations that you'd usually have for someone you've been seeing for a while. For example, one girl asked me to read to her to help her fall asleep before we'd even met in person. Another started getting upset with me for not responding quickly enough within just a couple of days of chatting. Others would suddenly bring up long-term plans and I'd be left thinking, "You do realize we only met a week ago, right?" In my opinion, especially when you're meeting someone for the first time, there's a lot of groundwork to be done before moving into a serious relationship. The process should involve meeting up, seeing how you connect, and then deciding whether to move forward. It's not about jumping from a first date straight into a serious relationship with plans for the future. When someone rushes into talking about commitment and long-term plans before you've even had a chance to really get to know each other, it can be overwhelming and a bit of a turn-off. The natural flow of getting to know someone should be gradual, allowing both people to feel comfortable and genuinely interested before making any big decisions. Story 8. I remember an experience from when I was a teenager, which still stands out to me today. I was working at a store in a neighboring city for a week to help out. I was transferred there temporarily from my usual location. During my time there, I met a woman who was also working at the store. We immediately clicked that night, and after our shift, we decided to take a bite to eat at a restaurant called Coco's. As we were enjoying our meal, a man suddenly walked up to our table. He seemed upset and started asking her why she hadn't picked up their child, as it was her turn to watch him. The situation quickly escalated, and they began arguing right there in the restaurant. It was incredibly uncomfortable. After a short while, the man went back to his car, brought their child inside, and placed him next to her in the booth before leaving. I tried to remain polite, finished the meal, and then told her I had to go home. The whole situation was so awkward. The next day, I returned to work at the same store, but she wasn't there that day. I worked one more day at that location, and again, she wasn't there. So I returned to my regular store without contacting her. A week later, she called me at work, since cell phones were in common back then, and asked me to meet her for breakfast so she could explain what had happened. For reasons I still can't quite explain, I agreed and met her the following Saturday in her city at a breakfast place. When I arrived, she was already there, but she wasn't alone. She had brought her mother and grandmother with her. The girl started apologizing, crying, and begging me for a second chance. Her mother and grandmother, who I had never met before, were also pleading with me to give her another chance. Keep in mind, I had only met this woman once. I can't recall exactly how the breakfast ended, but I know that I never saw her again after that. The whole experience felt surreal, almost like something out of the Twilight Zone. To this day, I still wonder how that man knew where we were eating, especially considering that cell phones weren't around to make communication easy back then. Story 9. On our second date, the girl I was seeing asked me to take her shopping. Since I didn't have my driver's license yet, my dad dropped us off. She led me to Victoria's Secret, where she wanted to shop for clothes and other items. After about an hour and a half, she seemed satisfied with what she had picked out and asked me to help her take everything to the checkout counter. I took the rest of her things and brought them over to pay. At that moment, she just stood there, almost as if she was expecting me to pay for everything. I made a lighthearted comment like, This is going to be expensive. Where do you work? To my surprise, she responded with something along the lines of, what do you mean? I thought you were going to help me out with this. I thought she might be joking, but she confirmed that she wasn't. She even tried to justify by saying something like, isn't it okay to make the lady in a relationship happy? There were a couple of issues with the situation. First, we'd only gone on one date before this, which was to the movies, and now this shopping trip. This didn't really feel like a relationship to me. Second, I was a teenager and didn't have $150 to spend on clothes for someone I barely knew. I kept refusing to pay, mostly because I genuinely didn't have the money, even if I wanted to. Eventually, she called her dad to pick her up instead of waiting for my dad to come get us. I'm really hoping that my next date, which is planned for the next weekend, goes better than this one. I've only dated 2 people before, and she was the first. But I don't think the next girl will be like the last one at all, so I'm feeling optimistic that things will work out. Story 10. I once went on a date with a girl I met on OkCupid. Since she didn't have a car, I drove 40 minutes to pick her up. When I got there, I noticed she didn't really look like her pictures, and she wasn't quite my type. Still, I thought, why not give her a chance? Who knows what may happen? She suggested we go to Denny's because, according to her, it had the best breakfast, which, by the way, it doesn't. We sat down and tried to have a conversation, but the topics she chose were odd. She commented twice about how attractive her server was, specifically mentioning that she liked girls with a certain body type. Then she started telling me about a date she had with a guy who was really into her, but she wasn't interested. To top it off, she made a remark about the number of people from a certain racial background at the restaurant. When the check arrived, it was on a single piece of paper, and she asked, "How much is it?" I showed her the receipt, and she started digging through her purse for money. Now, here's my take on paying for dates. If I ask you out, I'm happy to pay. If you want to pay for yourself, I respect that. I believe that when I do cover the bill, it should feel meaningful because it's not expected. So she's pulling out change, and I'm thinking, it's only about $20. I didn't enjoy the date, but I'll cover it anyway. I told her, I can pay for you, it's no big deal. But she insisted on paying her share. I couldn't convince her to save her money, so we headed to the counter to pay. Afterwards, she seemed completely disinterested in continuing the conversation. I asked her if she was alright because she seemed a bit distant, and she responded by saying she didn't like the rain even though it wasn't raining. As we drove around, I asked her what she wanted to do next. She just said she wanted to go home, turning down all my suggestions like going to the mall, movies, or bowling. Then came the real surprise. While I was driving her home after a few minutes of silence, she suddenly said, "I'm upset because you made me pay for myself." I was stunned. I explained that I thought she wanted to pay for herself, and I was just respecting her decision. But she kept going on about how unfairly she felt treated. I just stayed quiet. When we got to her house, she turned to me and asked, "Do you want to come inside for a while?" I politely declined, saying, "I'm sorry, but no." She walked off into her house, and I drove home. Not long after, she blocked me. Well, she made you dodge a bullet. Nice. Anyways, if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos like this. Story 11. I have many stories to share, so here it goes. When I was a teen, I just earned my driver's license, which gave me the freedom to go to punk shows at local VFW halls and hang out at the mall. At one of these shows, I met a girl with dreadlocks. We got along immediately, and she asked if we could hang out again. Her idea for a second meeting was a bit unusual. She took me along to the mall where she planned to shoplift from Hot Topic. I had no idea she was planning this, so I was completely surprised when she tried to pull it off. Unfortunately, we both got caught, and as a result, we were banned from the store. That ended up being our last real date, though we did bump into each other again during community college. In another case, there was a girl I had known since childhood, who had been my first crush when we both lived in a different town. Years later, as adults, she asked me out on a date. She took me to a paintball course in Pennsylvania's coal country during a snowstorm. But it wasn't just the two of us. She brought another guy along. It quickly turned into a competition where I had to face off against this other guy in a paintball duel, all in freezing, snowy conditions. I did pretty well in the first round, but then the cold got to me, and I ended up with hypothermia. I turned blue from the cold. Things got even stranger when her brother showed up at my place in California, where I had moved, and tried to pick a fight over who had the right to live there. Later on, I found out that she had hidden children and had married someone from Ecuador for practical reasons. Another incident was in San Francisco. I went to a concert by a punk band. During the show, a beautiful blonde woman started flirting with me. We ended up getting close and things were going well. So well, in fact, that the band noticed us. I was getting ready to leave with her and go back to her place in San Jose, where she suddenly revealed that she held beliefs that I couldn't agree with. She mentioned that she had strong negative feelings toward a particular group of people, and since I'm part of that group, I knew this wasn't going to work out. I decided to end the day right then and there. This last story is more recent. I met a woman in California who was like a female version of myself. She was also from New Jersey, had red hair, was good looking, and shared my feelings about her home state. She worked at a restaurant, and we agreed to team up and avoid returning to Jersey. We planned to go out together after Labor Day. However, one day she showed up with another guy casually mentioning that she had been living with him for months. I told her that she probably should have mentioned that sooner, and made it clear that I wasn't interested in continuing things. After that, I headed up north, only to find myself caught in the SF Bay blackout. To top it off, someone slammed their car door into mine, causing significant damage that required major fender repairs. Story 12. Back in the early 1990s, when I was serving the U.S. Army, things were quite different from today. We didn't have cell phones, so if you were living in the barracks like I was, you had to rely on the phone at the orderly room, or CQ, charge of quarters desk, to receive calls after hours. During that time, some people in the local community would find out the phone numbers for the CQ desk and ask them to contact soldiers. These calls often came from women who were looking for a military partner. They would call and ask to speak with a specific soldier, often with an unusual name like Private McGillicuddy. When we told them that there was no one by that name in our company, they would insist that the person was indeed there. After a few minutes of back and forth, they would usually say something like, "Well, if he's not there, could you chat with me for a while?" At 2 in the morning. It might seem like a harmless way to pass the time. However, these women were often trying to lure young soldiers into relationships, sometimes with the intention of getting pregnant quickly. This situation was so common that when we arrived at a new duty station, such as Fort Lewis, Washington, we'd get a briefing about it. The briefing included information on how to handle these calls, as the women were known for trying to trap soldiers into quick relationships. This issue became significant enough to be included in the initial orientation for new soldiers. Story 13. I had a couple of experiences when the balance between online communication and face-to-face interaction was really off. The first situation was with a girl I met online. I asked her out and she suggested trying a taco place. I was okay with that choice and thought it would be a relaxed and casual outing. We decided to meet at the taco place in the late afternoon. I prefer coffee dates for the first meeting, but I was fine with the tacos this time. When we met, I noticed that she didn't say anything. I ended up doing all the talking, but I kept my questions light and easy, like asking if she had any pets or what sports she enjoyed. Despite my efforts to keep the conversation going, it felt like she wasn't interested. After the date, I followed up a few days later and tried to make new plans, but the same thing happened. She didn't respond. I started to feel that it wasn't worth my time to continue. Another time, I was seeing a girl who preferred communicating only through text. While I was at the gym, she would send me messages like, "It got really quiet," and, "Well, yeah, it's a core day." When I mentioned that my arms were busy, she responded with, "Aren't your arms free?" This kind of texting while I was working out felt really out of place and frustrating. Our dates were strange, and she wouldn't talk on the phone. She would insist on texting, even though we were just 30 minutes apart and it was only our second date. I felt like she wasn't giving me the respect I deserved. A few months later, I attended her birthday party with another girl, who later became my wife. At the party, my former date brought a new boyfriend and spent the whole night arguing with him. We ended up helping him get a cab back to his car. Since then, I haven't seen her again. Story 14. I had 2 different dating experiences in a row, and each had its own set of challenges. On my first date, I met a girl who seemed to find my cautious behavior amusing. For example, when we were crossing the street, I made sure to look both ways and use the pedestrian walkway. She made fun of me for this, suggesting that I was being overly careful and even called me names in a mocking tone. I don't mind a little teasing, but her attitude felt more like ridicule. As we continued with our coffee date, she talked extensively about her mental health issues and mentioned that she wasn't taking medication for them. She seemed to see this as a way to present herself as strong, but it came across as more self-important than insightful. By the end of the date, it was clear that we didn't connect, and I didn't see a reason to pursue another meeting. The second date went a bit better in terms of the interaction itself. We enjoyed some friendly banter while bowling, and the chemistry was enough to consider a second date. However, as we were leaving, she started making disparaging remarks about children we saw, calling them names and making fun of them. While she didn't direct her comments at the children themselves, her attitude is more than just a lighthearted laugh at their expense. This behavior was a bit much for me, and I decided that a second date wouldn't be a good idea. Story 15. This happened quite a few years ago, and it starts with a bit of background. I was at a house party where I ended up tipsy. I blacked out, and when I woke up, I found myself in an unfamiliar room next to a girl I didn't know. I quietly got dressed and went to explore the house, trying to figure out where I was. I looked at the living room window to see if I could recognize the streets, but nothing looked familiar. Then I glanced at the driveway and saw my friend's SUV parked there. My friend woke up soon after and explained what had happened. It turns out that the girl I had woken up next to was at the party with a friend. The friend liked me, and when she found me later in the evening in an intoxicated state, she took me to her place. It seemed that I was part of the reason she decided to go home with the other girl. After a bit of talking with the girl I woke up next to, I learned that we were at her grandmother's house, which she had inherited, located about 30 miles from where I lived. Feeling unsettled about the situation, I asked her if we could go out that evening to get to know each other better, and she agreed. Later that day, around 6 in the evening, she arrived at my house earlier than planned. I let her in and said I would be ready soon, suggesting she make herself comfortable in the living room. When I returned to the living room, I was shocked to find that she had started a small fire using paper from my coffee table magazines in a large ashtray. She was focused on stoking the fire and didn't even notice I had come back into the room. I asked her what she was doing and she simply said she was bored. I put out the fire and told her, "I have cable TV you can watch. Please don't start fires in my home. If you need to start another one, go outside and do it in the street." I thought that would be the end of it. She stopped burning things and I went to my bedroom to quickly change clothes for our date. When I was changing, my phone rang. It was my neighbor from 2 doors down who asked how things were going. I said everything was fine, but he informed me that there was a woman starting a fire in the street in front of my house. I came up with a plan. I went outside as if everything was normal and my friend came over with an emergency that needed my attention. This caused the girl to leave, and I made sure to avoid her from then on. Story 16. I went on an online date with a girl I thought was really cute, and I was pretty excited about it. We had some good conversations leading up to the date, and I even bought a new shirt for the occasion. I took her to my favorite bar, which is casual and not too dive, so it felt comfortable. She lived in the suburbs and I lived downtown, so I met her at the train station. When she arrived, she had a strong smell of drinks on her. I figured she might have had a drink or two to calm her nerves, so I didn't think too much of it. Once we got to the bar, she started talking about her life. When I asked what she did for a living, she told me she worked as a farmer. I was a bit surprised by this, but I was also curious and wanted to see where the evening would go. However, things took a turn when she began making comments about Asian people. She complained about how there were too many Chinese people in her suburb and said she disliked them. This made me uncomfortable, but I was still hopeful that the date might improve and that we might connect on a personal level. She seemed interested in me at first, and when I tried to kiss her, she pulled back as if she didn't recognize me. That was when I decided that continuing the date wasn't worth it. I became quiet, and she reacted by starting to yell at me in the bar, accusing me of not talking and ruining the date. I explained that her comments and her lack of interest in anything physical had left me with little to say. She claimed she didn't remember making any remarks or my attempt to kiss her. I paid the bill and left the bar as soon as I could. It was the worst date I'd ever been on. Story 17. You pull up to the house and find her in the garage, which actually belongs to a friend she's staying with. She's buzzed, even though it's still early in the day. You're young and excited, so you don't let it bother you much. Unfortunately, while you're being intimate, the rubber breaks. On the other hand, she's not actually in her early 30s like she claimed, so pregnancy isn't a concern. However, she's very eager and starts being quite forward with you. Fortunately, she lives close to a park where you were just trying to find a private spot. The downside is that you're feeling quite sore from the bumping against a picnic table. Afterwards, she starts to pass out, which is a relief, but then you notice a large, intimidating man in the driveway where you picked her up. He's moving towards your car as she's stumbling out of the passenger seat. Luckily, you have quick reflexes and manage to maneuver out of the driveway. Driving at a high speed in the wrong direction in a one-way street, you find a spot to turn around and get back on the correct side of the road. You speed away, passing by the house where she's now arguing with the man who is shouting, "Who are you?" You were told she was single, but it seems there was a misunderstanding. Story 18. There was a girl I was really interested in, and we shared a lot of common interests. She had recently ended a relationship with one of my close friends. I decided to invite her, along with a couple of friends, to a hibachi restaurant near our university. During our meal, she started sending me distressing messages about wanting to harm herself. She also mentioned wanting to harm her ex and another girl she felt was unfairly taking her place. I was deeply concerned and tried to calm her down by suggesting she take a moment to breathe and focus on something else. After dinner, we went back to my car and then stopped by a nearby Walmart. While I was having a good time with my friends, I'd noticed she had disappeared. This caused a lot of worry among my friends who didn't know the full extent of her messages. We searched the store and eventually found her, but she ran off again. She claimed she was just playing hide and seek. When I finally located her, she was in the jewelry section and threatened to harm herself if I didn't buy her a necklace and several other items. I ended up spending over $300 that night on her and her meal. A couple weeks later, I found out she had started seeing someone who lived in the halfway house. It was clear that she had been using and manipulating me while seeing this other person. This experience was quite painful and took a significant emotional toll on me. Story 19. I once dated a coworker who, on our first date, took quite a while to get ready. She had put her son to sleep for her mom, which caused us to miss our movie plans, and we went straight to dinner instead. She was really apologetic about it. I understood because I had friends who were single parents and I knew how challenging that could be. The rest of the evening went well. We had good food, enjoyed a nice walk by a beach park, and ended the date on a positive note. She even gave me what I thought was the best kiss ever at the time. Because of this, I decided to continue seeing her. However, there were some red flags I noticed. Her son was undeniably adorable, and his biological father and my coworker seemed to get along fine. But as the months went by, I began to feel frustrated, though often she used her son as an excuse for various things. She would say things like, "I need to put him to sleep. I have to drop him off at his dad's. Can we bring him along?" Or, "He's sick, I'm sorry." I tried to be understanding, but it eventually wore me down. After about 3 months, I decided to be honest with her. I told her that I didn't see a long-term future for us because I wanted to be her main focus, and it wouldn't be fair for me to expect that given our situation. She wasn't too upset because she felt something wasn't quite right between us either. We stayed friends after that, and years later we became casual acquaintances. I'm glad to see that she found someone who truly cares for her and her children. Looking back, I realized that I need to be upfront with myself about my needs in a relationship. I've learned that if I can avoid dating someone with children, it might be better for me. And if I do date, I'll pay close attention to how children might impact the relationship. Story 20. I don't go on a lot of dates, but there was a girl I was chatting with on a dating app who mentioned she'd always wanted to visit a comic shop I frequently went to. One day as I was heading to the shop, she asked if we could hang out. I told her I was planning to go to the shop but wasn't really free for a full date. I suggested we could meet there and check out the store together if she wanted me to pick her up. She agreed, so I picked her up and we went to the comic shop. Once we arrived, I sat down to catch up with some friends who were also there. She mentioned she wanted to browse through some comics, so I let her go on her own. The shop wasn't very big, and I thought it would be fine since it was only about 20 feet away. I figured I'd join her soon. However, when I looked up from a conversation a few minutes later, she was nowhere to be found. I asked around, but nobody had seen her leave. She didn't have a car or a phone, so I was confused about how she could have gone home. I spent about an hour searching through nearby stores and parking lots, trying to find her. Eventually, I decided to send her a message in the app, hoping she was okay. About 20 minutes later, she replied to let me know that she had gone anxious and decided to leave. She had approached a stranger, asked to use their phone, and called for a ride home. Since I also have anxiety, I found it surprising that she would approach a stranger for help, but I understand that people handle things differently. After this, I decided to stop talking to her. I was left wondering if maybe she wasn't really interested in me. While it wasn't a huge red flag, it did make me think twice about dating someone without a car or phone, especially if they're active on dating apps. Story 21. This story isn't about me, but it involves my roommate from college who dated a girl with absolutely no filter. She was very blunt and candid about everything. After their first date, they went back to her dorm room across campus and ended up spending the night together. Then they came back to her dorm because she needed to do some urgent laundry and all the machines in her building were occupied. My roommate introduced her to me when they arrived and then headed straight for the shower. She sat down on my bed, right next to me, and told me something like, "My new boyfriend of just a few hours made a mess of my sheets and one of my pillowcases. That's a big issue that I'm dealing with." I was so surprised by her straightforwardness that all I could say was something like, "Oh, I hate when that happens." It turned out she was quite clingy. She shared a lot of very personal details about my roommate with anyone she talked to. In hindsight, I think she might have been on the spectrum, which makes me feel a bit sorry for her, but it was a long semester with her frequently knocking on her door looking for my roommate. My advice is to think carefully before getting involved with someone, and don't let your desires cloud your judgment. Story 22. I went on a blind date that turned out to be quite disappointing. When we first met at the restaurant, she seemed nice, but things quickly went downhill. For most of the evening, she was completely absorbed in her Instagram and Snapchat, barely looking up from her phone. She spent most of the time giggling and replying to her followers, making it hard for us to have a meaningful conversation. Whenever I tried to talk to her, she would respond with just a brief, "Uh-huh," or "That's cool." When the waitress came to take our order, she didn't even look at the menu. Instead, she immediately asked for steak, fries, and a glass of champagne. Then, out of nowhere, she asked me, "How much money do you make?" At that point, I decided the date wasn't going well and told her I was ending it. I got up and left her at the restaurant. Since she was so focused on her phone, she didn't really react other than to nod. Later, she started spamming my phone, upset that I'd left without paying for her dinner. She claimed that she had no money and no way to get back to her place. It seemed clear to me that she was more interested in getting free food and drinks than actually getting to know me. Well, if you like these stories, here's more. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. Catch you in that video.